Hi everybody, welcome to Photographer's Coffee Morning. This is a roundtable discussion, and today we're going to be talking about imperfection in photography. My name's Tom Wright. I'm a commercial photographer and educator, and we're going to have a conversation with some lovely people today about imperfection in photography, whether it's kind of something that we should be looking to introduce, or whether people think it's a bit of a kind of excuse for poor technique. So with all that said, I'd like to introduce our panel. So Oli, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit, and Steph, if she's about?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, so we're Oli and Steph of Oli Steph Photography.
Hi.
We photograph elopements. We're based up on the Isle of Skye, and most of our couples are eloping to the Isle of Skye. For those of you that see the video, you can tell we're in Scotland, like Neil, because we've both got beanie hats on because it's quite cold. Really excited to be here again, Tom, and excited to see how this is growing.
I mean, if you don't look like you're out of the Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou and you're in Scotland, I think you're doing life wrong. Like, I'm just surprised it's not a more vibrant orange, if I'm being completely honest. That's the only real complaint here.
Yeah, Neil's rocking the orange.
So where can people find your stuff, Oli and Steph? Like, where's the best place to get in touch with you?
You can find us on Instagram. It's Oli and Steph, OLI, and Steph, STEPH. Or you can find us at oliandsteph.com.
And you should, because the work's beautiful. With that said, let's move on to Savannah. So Savannah, do you want to give everybody a bit of a lowdown as to who you are and where they can find your work, just so they know who's talking when you speak up?
Yeah. Hi, guys. I am Savannah Groves. Hi. I'm based in the States in Southwest Missouri. I am an iPhone wedding filmmaker, and I also do a little bit of other than weddings, but that's my bread and butter, I guess. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here and be a part of the conversation today. I think it's going to be interesting. And you can find me on Instagram and TikTok at A Girl and Her Phone Videos.
And I cannot wait to talk a little bit more, because the main reason that we wanted you here today is because the thing you opened with, you're an iPhone wedding videographer rather. And for me, I've seen your work, and it's more than just, it does not look like it's just iPhone wedding videography. It's beautiful. But definitely can't wait to dig into that a little bit more. But with that said, Micah, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit and let people know where they can find your work?
Yeah, so I'm Micah of Humble Perspectives Photography. I primarily photograph weddings, and something that I sort of bring to the table is I'm pretty recently new, especially in my area. So yeah, you can find me on Instagram at Humble Perspectives Photography. It's just that.
I like it. It's good. And if you were listening to the last week's conversation, actually it's 2 weeks ago now thinking about it, Micah was involved in the chat then, so you've probably heard his voice before. And Neil, did you want to introduce yourself too? Because you're the one who proposed today's topic in the last podcast.
Okay, yeah, I'm Neil, and I am a wedding and now mainly an elopement photographer in Scotland. I'm a bit lower down in Scotland than Oli. I'm in the Central Belt, and I mainly cover Glencoe and round about there.
It sounds like you photograph like the driveway to like Oli and Steph's like photography business. Yeah, on the way up to Inverness. Like they could, if people really were feeling like fancy, they could get you to photograph them first and then head up to Oli and Steph afterwards and do the double whammy.
Yeah, just pass them off. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a pretty grand driveway. You're going to call it a driveway.
For definite. And it's the moat that's the really good bit for you getting across the water. But yeah, thanks, Neil. And so last week, Neil was talking about, basically wanted to talk about intentionally blurry photos, which is why we're having this conversation today. So we'll come back to that a little bit later. But last but absolutely by no means least, Nathan, do you want to introduce yourself? We'd love to hear a little bit more about you.
Yeah, my name is Nathan. I am a wedding photographer currently based in the Dallas, Texas area. Along with my wife, we are Nathan and Zoe Photography. So I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, based in Dallas along with my wife.
That's a great way to start. So for everybody listening in, so that's who's on the panel. So think about what people have just said here. When you hear from them, think of the background they're coming from. Predominantly today, we've got wedding industry professionals. We're not going to be talking mainly about commercial work. That is definitely a separate affair when it comes to imperfection. It's going to be way more client dependent. But for the people in this room, I think it would be safe to say that a large reason why your clients come to you as people is because of the way your work looks. And making decisions about how you're going to approach the photography or the interaction with your clients is an enormous part of what sets you apart as a business owner and as a photographer. So when we're talking about imperfections, there's a few different things we're looking at. In the previous conversation, for context, we talked about how certain approaches to photography can make your work feel more relatable or more nostalgic or give people cues back to childhood. And the intention here is to talk about ways that we do that, ways that you might embrace it, and our opinion on it. So largely because, Savannah, you've kind of built your entire business around this idea about making something feel real, accessible, and direct. Can you tell us a little bit about what draws you to the iPhone as a tool to record on? Like, what makes you want to use that as your primary capture method, Savannah?
I had a feeling you were going to ask me that. So I started thinking this morning while I was getting ready about, I wanted to really give like a good, thoughtful answer. And I was coincidentally listening to your last podcast episode you just put out. And he mentioned something about the distance that you feel as a videographer opposed to a photographer. And I think the iPhone eliminates that and doesn't just allow you to get closer to what you're shooting and interacting with, but it almost forces you to get in there and be a part of what's happening. And so I think that's probably one of the big aspects of what I love about it. And then coincidentally, it's small, it's familiar. And so because of that, people allow me that space to get in and get close and capture video in ways that other videographers aren't able to, just because of those two aspects. And I could talk about it all day, but those would be like my two big roundabout answers, I guess.
That's cool. And they're both kind of approach based. It sounds like really what you're saying here is that it's the access that it gives you, and the fact that you aren't going to take up more space than you need to, or more space than you think you should on the wedding day. You're not going to distract from what's happening. Would that be a fair assessment, or is there a better way of describing it than that?
No, I think that's a perfect way to describe it. And it hasn't failed at almost every wedding that I've filmed. I've heard that from people. Just saying, like, I either had no idea you were using an iPhone. I didn't even see you standing there. I love how small your equipment is and how approachable it feels. It doesn't feel intimidating, because cameras can be really intimidating for some people, but everyone has an iPhone in their pocket. So it just kind of breaks down a barrier that sometimes is naturally there with a big camera. So I think you said it perfectly.
And in terms of the actual aesthetic of it, like, how do you find people respond to the footage? Like, obviously you're doing something pretty unique in the fact that you're actually recording the wedding itself on an iPhone, that for a lot of people, they would consider that to be significantly more difficult than just using a larger camera with more control and a little bit more flexibility. How do your clients respond to the actual results that you send? Like, do they use any particular words? What's the reaction like from your couples?
Probably the biggest thing that I hear from them is that they can't tell a difference between my work and someone who uses a big camera. Can I see the difference? Absolutely. But the people that are hiring me can't. And I think they focus more on what I'm showing versus the quality of what I'm showing, if that makes sense, the story behind it and how I am pulling their emotions through the film, and just a lot of the choices and editing and things that I make. So it is more difficult, but instead of using those problems as an excuse to jump on a Fuji bandwagon or a Sony bandwagon, I've liked to get creative and solve those problems. And I've managed to do that. I haven't learned everything there is to know yet, but you would probably be surprised how much control you can get with an iPhone. I don't shoot in the native camera app. That's probably notable to mention. I use an app called Filmic Pro, which gives me almost complete manual controls that you would see a videographer with a big camera using. I can shoot in 4K. I can shoot in 10-bit color. So a lot of people are surprised to hear that iPhone does have that capability. But when you start diving in and actually looking at what you have in your pocket, you'd be pretty surprised how powerful it really is when you know what you're using. And then on top of that, there's companies like Moment that are creating amazing gear to supplement iPhone filmmakers and to just take everything to the next level. Lenses, ND filters, stabilizers, I mean, you name it, and it's coming out into the market. And it's just like, I feel like the sky is the limit with iPhone filmmaking. We're just getting started. So as people keep telling me, all right, when are you moving away from the iPhone? Come get a real camera. What are you doing? I'm like, we are seriously just getting started. I feel like we haven't even gone past the tip of the iceberg yet. So it's, sorry, I could talk about this all day. It's really exciting to me. So, but yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it definitely did. Without a doubt, that was amazing. And I guess one of the things that kind of stands out to me then is it's not that you're not doing this because you couldn't use a larger camera. You're making an aesthetic choice, essentially. You're saying, like, I want control, absolutely, but I want it to look like this, and I don't want to give up the flexibility and the access that I have. And I think that's something about what Neil was saying last week about lens selection, because the iPhone, I think it has a 24 or 26 millimeter equivalent main lens, and I think for a lot of people, they're gravitating more towards those wides. Is it 28, Neil?
I was just thinking, like, when you take a photo, like your couple are like, "Oh, can you take a photo on our phone for us?" And you take it, and it looks so much better than the photo you've just taken on your camera, because all the computational stuff going on behind the scenes on an iPhone is balancing the exposure and stuff like that a lot better than you're doing it in RAW. And you just like, yeah, sure, and you press the button, especially with iPhones, and you're like, oh my god, that's like looks so much more vibrant and wonderful than what I've just taken. But yeah, it's super interesting how the computer bit behind it all can help as well.
I was just going to say, because this is another thing that I like to touch on. So because I'm not shooting in the native camera app in iPhone, actually some of those like computational corrections are taken away. And I do shoot in a log color profile. So just like most other videographers who are shooting with a Canon, a Sony, and whenever they're in post-production are going in and doing some deep color grading, I am also doing that with the iPhone, which I could talk about iPhone colors all day, but that's its own set of challenges. But it's fun. It's not a problem to push aside and dismiss. It's a problem to be solved. So while I totally get what you're saying about the photo, and it is cool how iPhone does that, with the video aspect, that actually doesn't apply to me because I shoot in a log color profile. So I just wanted to touch on that because that's pretty cool too, that iPhone has the capability to do that.
Can I ask one last question on behalf of all the videographers listening? What do you do for audio? That's what they're all wanting to know.
Yes. So this is something that I am pretty passionate about, is high quality audio, because I think most people could agree that you could watch something maybe a little less quality if you really have the eye for it with good audio, versus if something looks incredible but has terrible audio. I don't know about you, but that to me is, I can't do that. So I film my audio on Tascam DR10Ls. I have 3 of them. And so any of the audio that you hear from my wedding films comes from those. And sometimes if it's just an unscripted moment that happens, which on a wedding day, that's always going to happen, my iPhone audio capture, I can work with it if I need to. So for some of those more authentic moments, I will pull audio from my iPhone.
I'm actually curious, little more, I guess, technical question or whatever, but like, what's like the storage situation and everything look like filming on an iPhone for a full wedding day? And then I don't know how you're editing the footage later on, if you're like bringing it into the computer and using Final Cut or anything like that, but I'm kind of curious what that process kind of looks like.
Absolutely. So storage, one of those issues in the beginning that it was a problem that I needed to solve. So once I upgraded a couple years ago to the 256 gig iPhone, I didn't have that problem. I could have 2 weddings on my phone at one time with all of my other daily apps and things going on. and it wasn't an issue. Now I have the 512, and it's even less of an issue storage-wise. You didn't ask about battery, but I'll touch on it anyway because it kind of goes hand in hand with that, another problem I needed to solve. So I will walk around with a fanny pack and some external batteries, and the gear choices that I make have to allow for me to be able to charge my phone while filming at any point, except my gimbal, which I don't shoot on my gimbal much anyway because I hate it. And then as far as Final Cut and editing, yes, I will upload all of my finals to a solid state drive. I would feel like probably any other videographer, and I edit all my films in Final Cut Pro 10.
That's awesome. And it's super helpful as well because it means that you're taking that raw footage, the kind of way you prefer to shoot, the footage you like to get, the way your kind of films feel, and then you're giving it the same narrative treatment that you'd use for any other job. Like you're not skimping on the story, you're just making a different visual choice. And what you were saying about audio especially kind of hit home because I've seen a lot of people do a lot of Super 8 films, for example, which is incredibly low quality, super blurry, not even necessarily a really useful frame rate. There's a bunch of issues with it, and people still love Super 8. So why wouldn't they love this footage that's been shot on an iPhone? And to kind of segue a little bit into the main topic of our discussion today, we've got a wide variety of people here, predominantly photographers, but all of us make choices that are going to try and make us stand out from the crowd. And when we're looking at different options for capturing moments and kind of everything that we do, there's always the option to do something a little bit differently. So for those of us in this room, I'd kind of like to get a little bit of a kick of where you fall on the kind of like intentionally doing things imperfectly spectrum. Have you made choices to lean into film or own all the sensor technology? Are you more about pristine and digital? Like, where do you lie on this spectrum?
I don't mind jumping in here. I love this topic because I feel like it's something that me and Zoe have talked about actually a lot as of more and more recently. At the beginning of our work, I feel like we definitely leaned less into the idea of like this imperfect and more into this like I guess editorial, like kind of like how nice can we make these pictures. And in the end, I feel like that ended up sometimes complicating our work more than necessary. You got into, more and more complicated lighting setups and more I don't know, just kind of complicated everything, leaning into that a little bit. But then the past definitely last 6 months, maybe even the past year, I feel like we've slowly, I guess just by our own artistic choices and everything, kind of tried to lean more into, like you said, that idea of the imperfect. We both fell in love with the idea of film photography, and we don't shoot a ton of film, for one because it's expensive, and for two because just the whole process of having to get it filmed off and developed and scanned is just a lot. But mimicking that in our digital work has become really huge for us, and we really love to try to do that as we're working through it. And there's been a few photographers such as to name two, John Dolan and Daniel Kim, that have kind of like inspired us over the past year. That's really, I felt like, helped us kind of lean into that even a little bit more. I actually even have John Dolan's The Perfect Imperfect book sitting right here next to me as we're talking right now.
And that was another catalyst, actually. Last week, Simon was talking about John Dolan's work specifically because of this, because of how much he leans into that. And the guy was like the first photographer published in Martha Stewart weddings, like way back when. So he's pretty much the OG, and he's been doing this consistently through that entire period. And it's interesting what you were saying about film as an inspiration as opposed to film as a capture medium as well, because that's pretty close to what I prefer to do. I haven't really seriously shot film in a few years now, predominantly because most of the good labs in the UK shut down or moved away. Our best lab, Peak Imaging, shut a couple of months ago, sadly, and as a result of that, there's been a bit of a vacuum and a mad scramble for a lot of the film photographers to find somewhere new to get the development done. A lot of the frontier scanners are breaking down, which means that we're kind of getting to a stage where at some point we're going to run out of technology to like digitize these things in the way that we've all been used to. So for anybody looking for the film look, in inverted commas, like the film look, that isn't necessarily going to be the same in a few years as we move to different scanning technologies and different film stocks, and eventually only Kodak's producing film. So there's a practical element to it. And again, those that are sticking to their guns and continuing to do things the way they've done it are now having to make technical choices to keep the imperfections that they want in their images. So they've been really selective about how they want their images to be imperfect so that they can continue to produce the work that makes them happy. So when you say using it as an inspiration but not using it as the be-all and end-all, that's incredible, because it's going to educate your eye. It's going to help you to develop a color palette over time, and you can then take the best aspects of that and incorporate it into all of your work and stay in control, which is really cool. With that said, so obviously, Nathan, that's really interesting to hear. Like, Oli and Steph, I know that you're kind of in a bit of a transition point at the moment, and obviously you've made some changes to the way that you're working. Like, do you do anything particularly to try and like degrade the images that you shoot, either in shooting or in post-production? Any kind of like halation or blooming or like old lenses? Is there anything that you do to your work that kind of adds some imperfection into it at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Like, this is definitely a topic that we're super interested in, and I have to say, like, I'm amazed how many of our contemporary photographers are using film. Especially for elopements. For us, the idea of using a film camera out on the hill in like poor weather conditions just sounds extremely stressful. Kind of always loved film photography. I worked at Jessop's about 20 years ago. I'm showing my age, and it was at the point where analog film was kind of being replaced with the first affordable digital cameras, and it was quite a sad time to work in the industry, because I just saw just so many old boys just bringing in all their old fully manual analog cameras and selling them for these like really crap digital cameras. But for us, we've come into this market a lot later. And so we're using Canon R6s. And one thing we've definitely noticed is that we found, particularly like the RF lenses, almost a bit too clean and sharp for people's wedding days. We're capturing portraits essentially. And those RF lenses are kind of, they're showing every little crisp detail on people's faces. And you don't always want that for wedding pictures. So I think early on we started using the Pro Mist filters, and so adding some diffusion that way. I'm not sure, like, I'm sure Neil can speak on this as well, but there seemed like this huge craze where it seemed like every Scottish photographer then started to use Pro Mist filters, and we kind of wanted to make our work look a bit different, so we've looked at other ways that we can add some softening to our imagery. So yeah, we do a lot of it now in a program called Exposure Software. It used to be known as Alien Skin. And so when we finish our images, we'll take them into Exposure Software and add halation in there.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting topic. And we recently had a shoot of our own when we were away on holiday in Mexico. And it was really interesting to see how a photographer used different techniques to try and make the images less perfect. So she even went to the point of having a filter on her lens, but then holding up an actually dirty filter in front of her camera for half the shots, which is something, like, we would never consider doing that ourselves. But when we got the images back, I was blown away by how ethereal and cool they looked. And you don't see all of those mosquito bites that we've got on our sunburn from staying out too long in the sun, and so all those imperfections are gone, and you're just left with like a feeling of an image. And I think that's what you really get from going away from that perfection. It brings out the feeling of the images more, and they're not so stark and digital looking.
So it's almost like you're trying to take more of an impressionist approach to taking the photograph. You're not looking for photorealism, ironically. You want something that's going to give you more a sense of the mood that you had at the time, and like kind of makes you puts you back in the headspace that you're in when those photographs are being taken, and relies less on like a literal, here is what it looked like, this is the place you were, and kind of taking a step away from that for the photography that you're consuming, by the sounds of it, at least. I mean, that's an interesting segue across as well, because obviously, Neil, you were saying that they mentioned that you might have used Pro Mist, etc. So do you do any of that? Do you use any kind of halation or softening filters in front of your lenses? Any older cameras? Like, how are you doing anything to kind of embrace these older techniques or these kind of alternative methods of softening your images?
I do, but I use them sparingly. use Pro Mist if there's extreme highlights. So like if I'm using a single window light and it's quite harsh, and it's really, really bright, I'll just mute it with a Pro Mist. If I've got crazy side light or whatever, I will use it. I've got a lens in my bag with the Pro Mist. I've got another 35 with it on. So I'm not mucking about with changing the filter. I'm just getting out my other Pro Mist 35 and rattling it on. But yeah, it's always wary that it can be overused. Like you see it all over the place just now, and the elopement photography, everyone's using Pro Mist filters and the Kitchener's preset, and it's and they're doing it for a reason. It looks wonderful, but then everyone's work starts to look the same, you know. So yeah, I do it intentionally, but always remember to take it off because you can't reverse the effect of a Pro Mist filter.
100%. And like you were saying about the kind of the way that things end up being the same, you kind of get these folklores that kind of build up around some of this kit. Like the second somebody mentions a Black Pro Mist, like some people might instantly know what it is, others might not. For those that don't know, Black Pro Mist is essentially a UV filter with black specks in it. And they come in strengths from like 0 to 2 in like quarter stop increments. So like a 1/4 Pro Mist, an eighth stop increments. It's 1/8 is the weakest, then it goes to a quarter, then a half, then a whole, then a 1 and 2, and on and on and on. And the more that you've got this effect, the more your highlights kind of bloom. And if you're not sure exactly what bloom is, if you've ever been on the road at night when you drive in and you kind of see lights coming past and you see the point source of the like street lights getting kind of spread on the windscreen, that's bloom. That's what bloom looks like. And that is incredible when it's in the right context. So like Neil said, he was using it when he had a side light, and the effect then is that somebody's skin will glow slightly rather than you just seeing every single hair that's on their skin, because we all have like down hair on our skin. That's just a thing. And if you don't want to see that in every photograph, it's a good idea to do something to soften it. Either put the subject in more flattering light if you have the option, and if you don't, do something like Neil mentioned, soften it using depth of field or a Pro Mist filter or something else that's going to take away the contrast in those areas so you don't see the detail. So if you hear somebody talking about bloom, halation, Pro Mist, these things are all trying to do the same job. So what Oli and Steph are doing is trying to do that in post-production as a finishing step. And what Neil is doing is using it very sparingly in real time to kind of bake it into his images and complementing it with a lens that he knows will respond well with that. Again, that was just context for anybody that didn't instantly know what Black Pro Mist is. If you've heard of a Moment Cine Bloom or a Glimmer Glass or any of these things, they're all doing the same thing. They're just trying to soften skin on highlights, and sometimes they'll raise black point and reduce sharpness a little bit. So if you weren't sure, that's what it is. We all learn somehow. There's also a little bit of a kind of a trend for YouTube videographers to recommend it for everything. So what Neil was saying about using it sparingly is important because it looks absolutely horrific in some lighting situations. If you're already in mist in Scotland and you add a Pro Mist, what you've got is fog and you can't really see anything. And that's kind of like, it's about understanding where the limitations of your tools are. And like Neil mentioned, he uses that tool when it's most appropriate. Like Micah, so you're next. Are you doing anything to kind of dirty up your images, or do you try to keep them as pristine as the camera made them?
So I've always I learned on digital. So I came into the photography world post switch, but I've always been enamored with film, like the idea of film. I think anybody my age and younger is like, to use the most unfortunate word, like film is the vibe, right? And so I've shot some film because I inherited a film camera, and that's been great. It's not at all like my work. All that to say, like when I first started to learn how to edit, the first thing that I did was I just crushed my blacks. I just went to my point curve and I like brought my blacks so far up and then just essentially increased the contrast from that higher black point. So I've always been I've always wanted somewhat of a thicker look than the pristine what I would get straight out of camera. So what I'm doing right now is I'm actually, in an effort to make my work a little bit more consistent, because I don't really have what I really want for my wedding work to look like yet. In an effort to make that more consistent, I've actually started playing around with some film packs from Maston Labs, which is a film emulation preset pack. But I've noticed that I like my images more. Even with that added on, I will go into Lightroom and I will take off the added texture and I will take off the default sharpening that Lightroom does. Part of that is because I use Fujifilm cameras, and Lightroom tends to over sharpen Fujifilm files anyways. All that to say, I try to find somewhere in between. Like, I want something that's a little bit more abstracted than what was physically there to elicit more of the emotions that were going on. But I still want to not go overboard. And I feel like some of my past work or my personal work definitely stretched a little bit too far. Like, my blacks were a little bit too high, and stuff like that. But, that's just part of learning how to edit. So, yeah, if that answers your question.
100%. So again, you're striving for something a little bit different to reality. You're not looking to make an accurate account, but you're primarily doing that in post-production. You're not really sure where you would start if you were doing it physically. That makes perfect sense to me, Micah. Thanks for that. And to kind of give a bit of context for me, like I started my career in photography teaching workshops for the Impossible Project, the company that eventually became Polaroid again. They basically reformulated all the film after Polaroid went bust and sold all the machinery up. They had to make everything again, and they released a kind of Polaroid film that literally had it was useless. They made a color film that only produced the color pink, and then if you left it long enough, it would turn blue. The cameras, like, by and large, didn't work. Most of the good ones were made in the 70s and 60s. Their lens was like f10. The film was 100 speed, which meant you got horrific motion blur. The film was enormous. So even at f10, there was really shallow depth of field, so it was hard to keep the images in focus. And if you didn't heat the images as they came out of the camera, they wouldn't develop at all. If they hit any light, they'd go white. So basically, I started out from a position where I was basically brought in to stop people from returning the film, because people did not know how to get an image out of this stuff. And especially at the beginning, it was really important that we teach people to, one, embrace the things that you can't change. So if you're going to be shooting Impossible Project film and you don't like pink, you're shooting the wrong film, because that's what you're going to get. The best case scenario was an imperfect product. But what we did was an awful lot of work to make it so that the imperfections that you kept were the ones you wanted. So if you wanted motion blur, but you wanted as close to true color as you could get, we would work on like what temperature to keep the film at and like what environments you could produce that look in. But as a result, it became pretty obvious that for a lot of people, they would take absolutely terrible photographs, as in like they had no thought or intention behind it, and then think it was artistic because it had things like motion blur and color shifts. And I think this was a little bit about where the comment came from in the last conversation about, can we talk about these intentionally motion blurred images? Because there is a huge difference between somebody intentionally making a choice that will benefit the final image or experimenting in a way that they can then implement into their work, and somebody that's just doing something because they think it's creative and other people are doing it. And perfect example, Nathan, you mentioned that you picked up the Perfect Imperfect from John Dolan. There are lots of images in that book that incorporate motion blur, but he hasn't just taken the camera and shaken it to get that. So all that said, this is supposed to be a setup for a slight change of topic, in that there are lots of people that see these things being executed perfectly and don't necessarily understand why they're doing it or what result they want. And I wonder what your opinion was on trying those new things out on client work, whether you think it's successful at all, regardless of who's doing it. What are your opinion on adding in those elements to your work?
Because I come from an interesting perspective that I don't deliberately do that blurry photo thing. I've never done it. I'm not going to start doing it now because it's all over Instagram. It's not the way that I roll. I don't like change my style and based on what's trendy. It's just my work's looked the same for the last 14 years, and it's working for me, pleases my clients and stuff like that. So that's why I tend to stay clear of these trends. However, I quite like it. So although it's not a trend for me, I totally get it, and I like the aesthetic and stuff like that. But yeah, I won't use it. Maybe change, don't know. Nah, I probably won't use it, but I do enjoy the aesthetic of it. But I've got kind of opinions that are the same as my ProMist thing. So when are you using it? I think some moments I'm seeing, when a lot of them, it's when they're entering the room and stuff like that. That's usually quite a good moment in a Scottish one, because you've got the bagpiper and stuff, and they're like they fist pump the room. They're all excited to see everyone. Everyone's cheering, a lot of energy. And if you choose at that moment to blur that photo on purpose, you've got to think long and hard if that couple wants that, because they're your client.
There was a main theme in the interview we just completed with Dennis Roy Coronel, because he does make quite extensive use of motion blur in his images, but like you mentioned, he's using it sparingly, and he's not prioritizing it over a client's needs. He's quite clearly telegraphing it. He's showing it really loudly and strongly, and not experimenting on his client's dime, which I guess is the point you were trying to get to. Is that fair?
Yes, Tom, that's exactly it. Why put the don't risk an important moment on blur because your couple might not like it, and at the end of the day they're your client. By all means, be creative on the photo shoot, on the couple shoot, because you've got time, you've got the safe images bagged anyway, and that's the time to experiment. But if you're showing on your website important moments that are blurry for whatever reason, then maybe your couples are expecting that.
Talking about that idea of the motion blur and everything like that, I think it even kind of goes back to, I think a lot of us have kind of mentioned like this inspiration, at least from film photography. And like Micah said when he was talking earlier, he said, for anyone who's like a little bit younger, a little bit newer to the photography industry, he said film is the vibe. And I think I definitely get that, because it's definitely kind of like the trend that like Instagram's going towards. And I'm kind of in the same boat. Like me and my wife didn't start photographing professionally until the very end of 2019, pretty much 2020. And so my first camera that I did any sort of professional work on was already mirrorless. So I started on the XT3. And so that's like where I started. So I was far removed from film and anything like that by the time I started my professional career. But I think this idea of kind of like emulating that has kind of started. And then as I've worked a little bit of film like into my work, talking about, the idea of motion blur and everything in images, I think that even goes back to that, because, like, as you're shooting film, if I'm doing an engagement session and I'm shooting on my, my Pentax, and I have 400 rated film in there, I can't just bump the ISO so that I can shoot at a faster shutter speed. I'm kind of stuck where I'm at, and that shutter speed is just going to get slower and slower as the night goes on. And so that motion blur is just naturally happening because I don't really have an option. And so I think that film emulation kind of even feeds into that idea of the motion blur in the images.
I think you're right, and it's something that often gets missed, because if you do kind of give yourself the constraint in camera that, right, cool, this is the scene, but if I was shooting this on film, I would be rating it at ISO 640, or I'd be doing it at ISO 320, and then you approach the scene like, that's the film I've got in my digital camera. Like, how do I how do I tackle this problem with those constraints, it does change the way that your work is. Whereas if instead you just set your shutter speed to 1/8 of a second and just wobble your hand, like it's not going to give you the same look, because that you wouldn't be in that lighting situation to get that result. Like there's a reason for it, and the reason we love it is because it was a technical limitation at the time. And there's something I wanted to kind of segue into a little bit before I ask the second part of the question for this. But there's a huge trend on TikTok at the moment for people picking up digital cameras, digital point and shoots from 10 years ago, because all of a sudden people are looking for something called CCD smear, which happens exactly like these promise filters we're talking about before. Like if you shoot a CCD sensor into a point source, it blooms. If you shoot it into a really strong point source, you actually get like stars coming off these points of light because of the way that the sensor's designed. And we haven't used CCD sensors. I think the most recently produced one was the M9P from Leica. It's a fairly, like, I think Neil's just going to go grab his by the looks of it, but he's kind of like,
yeah, I'm going to find it.
Cool. We'll see you in a sec. But yeah, so the M9P was like a camera that used the CCD technology because basically it was a sensor technology developed by Kodak with film in mind. It was designed for people to transition from film to digital. And all of a sudden, kids are looking at cameras that we would think would be absolutely useless, like 5 megapixel Canon point and shoots from 2004 or 2005. And it's like, these are things that we discarded and didn't look at because they weren't in that nostalgia range for us. Like for us, the images that we lust after are the film point and shoot photographs. It's the stuff that our parents had. And as that kind of moves forward, the things that we think are desirable are going to change. And I think one of the shortcuts is that motion blur is a pretty common defect with most cameras. Like most cameras don't have enough light on them, don't have enough sensitivity. But when you make wise decisions about what you're going to use, it's great. So like Neil's just brought his M9P, and this is a rangefinder camera. But Neil, can you tell us a little bit about what you like about this and why you keep using it?
Yeah, look how battered it is. I know this is a podcast, but I'm holding up the battered.
If a Leica's not battered, is it really a Leica?
I like the sound of the shutter, Tom, and I'm hoping it comes across.
I'm ready. Well, that's pretty sexy, I'm not going to lie. I probably shouldn't say that about a camera shutter, but I'm a real nerd, so...
But yeah, no, the sensor's amazing. The colours are so unique that you get from it. The limitations is you don't shoot it above ISO 800, really. You don't really get away with that, which is crazy nowadays. But no, I just love it for the color represents the CCD sensor reads colors differently. You get really, really nice reds and stuff like that. So, yeah. And I love the sound.
So, I guess the follow-up question is, are you shooting that on a wedding day instead of one of your Nikons?
No. I should maybe take it, but it's it's more of a carry-around camera. I might actually take it along.
You see, I want that.
A bit buggered,
I want that
so
for you.
It's not very reliable, but yeah.
That's my favourite thing I think I've ever heard you say. It's a bit buggered and it's not very reliable.
It's not for weddings, man.
But you see, this is the thing though, because I kind of like that you've made that distinction, and this brings me quite neatly onto the second thing I wanted to ask. Like Neil had made a point about, I like it, I really like this trend, but it is not my brand. It's not for me. And I'm kind of interested in working out how everybody makes those decisions. And I really want to start with you, Savannah, because again, like for you to have made the decision that you have to have really strong core brand values of what you think is important to you. So when you do see somebody using a technique that isn't like yours and wouldn't apply to your camera, like how do you remind yourself that isn't for you and you can just keep on doing what you're doing and blazing your own path?
It's really hard, honestly, because I feel like since I've started, I've heard nothing but, okay, when are you getting a real camera? And so I think part of my motivation behind it has been, how do I get my work to a point and get my story across to where that question shifts from why wouldn't you to why would you? Yeah, look what you're doing. It's so cool. It's so different. I think another thing too is that I think that there is coming a time where, and I think we've talked a little bit about this, Tom, where iPhone is starting to enter the scene. And so I kind of want to be a part of that. I'm sure there are more people like me, but I don't know of many. And I love being someone who, I've made all the mistakes and I've learned some of the tricks. And so I like to help lead that conversation. And it's not just iPhone, but it's for any piece of equipment you might pick up and write off as, well, this isn't for weddings, which Neil, I love your camera and totally respect everything you said. Here's my counter to that. Something you would pick up and say, well, that's not for a wedding. Well, does it pose a problem to write it off, or does it pose a problem to solve? Well, that probably might pose a problem to write it off. A lot of people do that with iPhone. And so I've decided to just change the narrative on that and say, no, this is a problem. These are problems I'm choosing to solve with it, and kind of change people's minds. A lot of that is my motivation behind it. So just trying to, it's really not my couples that I'm trying to convince. I could work and shoot weddings as much as I'd want to. And I do. And I'm so grateful for that. It's people in our industry that I am working to help educate and change their minds. And I'm trying to make myself better and learn more, and just figuring out how far I can push this iPhone to its max potential until people finally, like I said, change their question to, oh yeah, why would you want to move on to Fujifilm when look what you're doing? So
I mean, I can already say that for everybody in here. There's no reason you should change anything. Savannah, your work is incredible. I'm just going to say it flat out because you need to hear that again. And you're maybe unique in the wedding industry, but commercially, I think we were all saying this last week, most of us that have worked in the commercial space have been asked by a client to use an iPhone because it seems more honest and more relatable and a little bit less contrived, and there's less of a kind of a barrier between you and your audience. So for anybody that is trying to encourage you to drop what you're doing because they want you to do what they're doing, you don't have to listen to them. Keep doing what you're doing. That's great.
Thank you. I think with anything too, it's, do you have knowledge of what you're using? Because if your issue and your question, if you're questioning my quality, you're questioning whether or not that I understand the tool that I'm using. So if you see my quality, you wouldn't question my knowledge. I think that could be with anything. I think you can make anything work for what you're wanting to accomplish, but do you understand what you're using? And then how can you add external things to achieve what you want your end product to look like? Which is why I don't just shoot with this. I've got mounts for a lens, and then on my lens I have a mount for an ND filter, and I have external lighting, and I have all the things that help me achieve the end look that I want to get. And I think that there's still more to learn when it comes to that. And I think that could be applied with anything you want to pick up and create something with. So it's just a lot of trial and error, and really figuring out what you want your stuff to look like, and then learning, okay, how do I use what I have to achieve that?
Yeah, I think that's good, Savannah. But this is not going above ISO 800 and not having autofocus.
Yeah, no.
It's quite complicated.
No, totally respect that.
I do think, though, that still brings up an interesting point. Like you said, you can't go above ISO 800. It doesn't have autofocus. On kind of this thought in your professional work / we work in this creative thing, kind of this separation of my equipment to do professional work, my equipment that I just enjoy using, and where the meshing of that is. Because my main camera that I shoot for weddings now, probably 75% of the images I'm shooting from the day is on a GFX with a Voight 58 adapted to it. It's got no autofocus whatsoever, and I'm shooting it for most of the images that I shoot on during the day. And so I think like that's an interesting point on like where that is, because I love doing that. And then, I also carry around, or did, I actually just sold it, but the Fuji X100V, it's like I can't even switch lenses on that camera, and it definitely has its own limitations compared to another camera or whatever. And I think that that's an interesting point to be made and talked about, kind of that like meshing of like, where does my like personal interest versus my like professional work kind of meet with that like equipment that I'm using.
And it's ironic because your work equipment is the stuff that I like to use for personal. Like that Voigtlander 58mm 1.4 is like a full frame lens that people put on a medium format sensor to get them a look like old school film, like 6.7s and 6.45s with fast lenses on it, for people that don't know. But yeah, that's the kind of stuff that I crave, and like being able to be a little bit slower and not have to work quickly. Like when client demands aren't the same, that's the kind of kit that I really enjoy using. And I kind of understand what you're saying, that you've allowed yourself to put that into your personal work, but I also think environment is a big thing. Like Neil and me and Oli live in a very different place. There was literally one of the weddings I shot the year that I stopped shooting weddings. I didn't go under ISO 1600 the whole day because it was dark. The ceremony was at 3 p.m. and it was already pitch dark, and the ceremony was in a Catholic church and that was dark, and like there was no way that I could ever shoot a camera that only shot at ISO 800, because I'd be shooting the entire wedding at an eighth of a second at 1.4. Like it's just it wouldn't work. And I know this is kind of part of what I really like about the photography industry, because we do all live in different places. We all have different experiences and we've all got different constraints. Like Nathan, like every time I see your work, I think it looks stunning, because you do nail that fine art look. You've got that amazing kind of film look, and you've made really intentional choices, and you have leaned into the things that you find interesting. Neil, like your work has a sense of atmosphere and place like nothing I've ever seen. And Oli, Oli and Steph, like you sent me some raw files earlier today, and literally they are mind blowing. Like completely unedited, the way that you see your environment is second to none. And I'm not just saying this to blow smoke up you. It's impressive, and every single one of you is different. And I think the point being that everybody hit on, and Savannah kind of pushed quite hard, is like, well, will this work? Can I make this work? And you're doing that kind of stuff outside of your professional environment. You're not just sitting back on your laurels and thinking, well, I'm not going to try anything. And like Neil, like being able to say that I don't like motion blur, that's cool, because now you need cameras that will shoot at ISO 1600 plus all day and be fine, because otherwise they're not going to work. It's like
I said I did like it, but I won't do it. Remember, just to make that clear.
Absolutely. This is true. I said you don't like it. Like that's wrong. I was trying to say that your preference is that you're not going to create it.
I do it at dancing, shutter drag. I do it at dancing.
Yeah.
With the Kayleys and stuff like that. I've always done that. Yeah. But yeah. But I don't do it when they're like walking across the street or stuff like that.
And that's kind of a separate thing. Like if nobody's ever photographed a Kaylee, they're incredible, but good grief are they fast. Like if you don't have a flash, you completely toast, because they do them in rooms with like a candle lighting everybody as well. It's amazing. But that said, like I wanted to make sure we hear from as many people as possible. Like Neil, did you want to talk a little bit about how you make that distinction between things that you visually gel with and things that aren't for you and aren't for your brand? Like how do you make that distinction for your own work? Is it just a gut thing?
Yeah, I think so. I'm probably a bit old school in the sense that like 99% of the time I shoot for my client. So I always just want to make them look awesome, relaxed and happy, and luckily I do it in like amazing looking places, so I do some shots for me occasionally if I'm feeling playful, but it's normally to do with composition, light, and more color, and more using like old school art principles like composition, light, color, perspective. I like playing with that rather than say like motion blur or direct flash, because was it David Beckham's son or something done it? Was it? Yeah. So I'm not
for
going
Burberry, I think it was.
Yeah, No, he shot a wedding, did he not? Who was that? He shot a wedding, and that's what kind of started this direct flash. It's Oli's. Yeah, am I right, Oli? Was it that guy? Yeah.
I think you're spot on. I can't remember which of the Beckhams it was.
It was Brooklyn's wedding.
Brooklyn's wedding. The photographer got some direct flash straight on them, and they went viral. And
yeah.
I mean, I think there are already a lot of photographers on that trend, but yeah.
There was also a photographer that done it, and he wasn't a photographer, and he had a rich dad. I can't remember. Anyway, so because they do it, direct flash and stuff like that, that's another trend just now. I like the look of it. I like Bruce Gilden's work. He done it on the streets of New York, and it's wonderful. But I'm not going to suddenly start doing it because it's on Instagram. So I enjoy the looks of these things, but I'm not going to start doing it because other people are.
That makes sense to me, and it's a brand thing as well, because you've got to think if everybody starts following that trend and you do as well, you're not standing out at all. You've just jumped on something you don't fully understand with no real basis. Actually, Oli and Steph, I wanted to kind of ask you guys about that too at this point, mainly because of all the people here, you have a very, very, very customer first approach to the way that you run your business. You're very aware of the people that invest their time and money into being with you for their wedding day, and I wondered how precious of you are of those moments are you? How much do you allow a little serendipity in, and how much do you want to be more in control? It'd be interesting to see how you make the distinction between work you like and your visual identity as a brand.
But I would say for us, our brand is very much about adventure. And as you said, the people that are booking us, they're coming to Scotland, mainly from the US, Canada, because they want to have that adventure on the day. So the photos aren't necessarily everything. It's more about experience as well. So on the day, we try and let things unfold as naturally as we can. And I think maybe we have one advantage in the fact there's two of us. So one of us can be getting those safe shots while the other one's doing a little bit more experimental stuff, which we find works really well for us. And we're not doing tons of experimental work, but we do like to, try and utilize what we have. So, we're out, it's usually windy, possibly raining, and we've got these dresses blowing in the wind. And I think using some slow shutter speed for some of that can look amazing and just really give, adds to the feeling of the adventure and the movement in those images. Yeah. So that's one of the main ways that we're kind of utilizing.
Yeah, I'd add to that I think it helps the client experience. We've probably shot most of the critical moments in the day, the ceremony, getting ready and things a bit safer. And actually later on in the day, perhaps, in an 8-hour elopement, we've got a lot of time with our couple. They really enjoy it. If we sort of say, look, we're on the hill, the lighting conditions are beautiful and soft now, should we try some slow exposures of you just swirling your dress around? Or perhaps you're going to have a first dance together and we'll shoot some of them in a slow exposure. Sometimes even change to black and white on our camera so we can, can be thinking ahead and thinking these are probably going to look strong as black and white images. I think we're very lucky that there's two of us in this business. So, Steph's absolutely right in what she says, but obviously we still have our moments where we obsess over our imagery and our artistry, but definitely the client experience is more important. And
Yeah, I think it's a balance for us because, like Neil says, we don't want to just be jumping on all the trends. Yeah. And I think some of the stuff gives me more much more fine art vibes, which doesn't really correlate with the adventure vibe that we're trying to go with. Yeah. So we have to think very carefully as to which things we want to, think that looks great and amazing that there's other photographers are doing that and what actually fits with our identity. So that's what everyone needs to do, really.
We're really trying to differentiate ourselves away from a lot of other Scottish photographers that really already have that nailed. There's so much talent up here already. So I think our imagery is very clean and modern looking, and we are relying on high-end digital cameras. For me, the thought of taking an old film camera up on the hill with a couple just scares the heck out of me. I wouldn't want that. I want eye focus. I want the reliability of my camera, and and we use it for our personal work. We've got a Pentax 67. I've got £2,000 worth of Kodak infrared aerochrome just sitting in my freezer waiting for an experiment. But I'm not going to take that out with a wedding couple. That's just for us to play with,
You see, now I just want to visit you to see if I can steal some of that aerochrome. I'm not going to lie. That sounds awesome. But I think it's interesting because like the core of what you said there was that essentially you want it to enhance the way that it felt. So when you're using motion blur, you're doing it because actually, no, I don't want the whole thing to look shaky or like I'm like at a party, or it's like, no. What does the environment do to the people in the frame? And it's also the reason why a lot of cinematographers like refuse to shoot at anything other than like a 50th of a second on shutter, because it makes motion look real. So when you're looking at slow shutter for that purpose, that makes total sense to me. But again, you're doing it for a brand reason, for a story reason. You're not doing it because of a trend. You're thinking, no, how does this feel? How is the environment affecting the couple, and how do we remind them of what that environment was doing to what was happening on the day? It's a really interesting way of approaching it.
Sure.
Definitely want to come back and steal the aerochrome though. I'm just going to say that again. It isn't a joke. I'm going to steal some of your film. It's going to happen.
You can have some. If you visit us, Tom, you can have some.
Ollie, I'll swap it for the contents of my freezer, but you don't get to see what's in my freezer beforehand.
We're vegetarian.
I'm a vegan.
Neil's vegan.
Even better.
Oh, okay.
There we go. So it might be curly fries. I'd just like to add, Ollie, that that's a bang on use of what of the kind of intentional imperfections, because I think it's intentional imperfections but with purpose. So you're choosing the time to use it, and you're doing it because it tells a story. It adds to the experience. Yeah, I like that. That's all I thought.
That's good. Thank you, Neil.
And again, thanks again for sharing it, because I wanted to definitely touch on some of the pro and actually use these techniques as well, because it is genuinely emotive if you do it right. And again, like I said before, I've seen your raws. I think that these images look amazing. So Micah, like obviously, like we said before, like you said you're still experimenting. So I guess for you, this filter must be more and more important. So when you see work from other people that you really admire and you think this could fit for my work, how do you make the decision about what should stay and what you can just enjoy and move on from?
So are you saying like for actual client delivery, or like how I make decisions? Okay. So on a day, I usually more similar to Neil, I much prefer experimenting with composition and lighting, because that's like something I was always interested in when I first started photography. I mean, and the shutter drag as well is something that I've always loved. I usually save that for just receptions though. But in terms of like experimenting, I'm still so new to running a wedding day solo, since I did so much second shooting last year, that I'm still trying to find my process in like just the logistics of a wedding day, and how I want to interact with my couples and how I want to navigate the other social dynamics that, for the most part, as long as it helps tell a story, I include it in the gallery, essentially. And that includes like if I do happen to have a somewhat blurry photo, or if I am doing like a shutter drag, if there's a waterfall, I'm going to do one photo that I have a slower shutter speed, like at least one. And then if it turns out great, if it doesn't, then I don't include it. But I would say for me right now, I don't do a whole lot of experimenting other than angles and what I'm focusing on. But if I do see something that I like, for say on Instagram, I just save it to a folder, and I'll essentially look at it later. I might try to implement something, but most wedding days right now, I'm just focused on all of the social and logistics side of things.
And that makes perfect sense. So that you're kind of in a phase of active experimentation where you're going through and trying to work out what stuff fits for you. So your filter at the moment is more like inspiration separate from execution, and then when you've executed, you can then decide like, was this successful? And then essentially everything that you feel works like gets delivered to the client, and everything that doesn't just gets removed. It's not like you're curating ahead of time or philosophically. It's like an experimentational thing, which is like, I just want to kind of like make it clear as well that that's a really useful way for a lot of people to learn. Like if you're an active learner, you shouldn't shy away from doing that. Like if you can make a room for experimentation in your client process, and you know you will not end up compromising anything in doing that, you should do that. Like for me, I'm definitely more of a theoretical learner. I like looking at what I did and what the results were, and then thinking about how I could do it differently for next time. And I think a lot of people are more like you than me. So the fact that you sharing that is useful, because like a lot of people will just say, well, I just do this thing. Like, what are you talking about? I go and make the photographs, and like then I feed myself outside of that on high quality stuff, and then good stuff comes out. And I think that's not popular enough of an opinion, really. So thank you for sharing it, Micah. It's appreciated. And I can say that I really do like the stuff that I see that you're producing already. So you should be proud of whatever's coming out the other end of it, whether you feel like it's intentional or not. It's got intention on the other end. Thanks. With that said, everybody, I just want to say a huge thank you for you all for coming in, and like basically, I wanted to kind of leave a few minutes for everybody to kind of ask any other questions they might have for anybody on the panel. So we've got 6 people here with different, like wildly different areas of expertise, and then you've got me who's a host. So if any of you have any questions that you wanted to ask about imperfection in photography, or anything you thought you could add that would kind of add some dimension that we haven't covered, feel free. Like Micah, go ahead, you're unmuted if you wanted to add something in.
Cool. Yeah. I just had a question about like the value of imperfection in photos over time. So like, and this can be one of those situations where it's just like, if you have a photo and it's just like one of the family photos, right? Where just everybody's in there, and you can have like that one uncle just sort of on the end, but like that's the last photo that's ever taken of him. And which was the case for one of my uncles during COVID. And it's just like the photo that is at that person's funeral, right, was from this wedding. That's sort of an extreme example, right? But I wonder what is the value over time of the imperfect photo compared to the more perfectly executed photo? And I just wanted to get your guys' opinions on that.
Can you define?
I think there are 2 answers to that question.
Oh, I'm sorry, Tom. I just wanted to know, I wanted you to define, because I think I know what you mean. I want you to define what you think is imperfect.
Sure. So like, I have this one photo that I took of a grandmother at a wedding that I did last year. And in one edit, I just kept it simple and clean. And then for an alternative edit, because I felt like it fit this artistic aesthetic, it was black and white, raised blacks, heavier on the grain. And so like between those 2 photos, which one's value is going to go up over time to the client, if that makes sense?
I think with that, it comes down to the idea of if it's going to get more value with time, then I feel like then the reason for the imperfection has to relate to the amount of emotion that is present in the photograph. And I guess that is going to be a little different for each person and different opinions. But if that black and white picture of that grandma, if taking the color out of that photograph eliminated distraction from the image so that you could then focus on the emotion of the grandmother more, then it could have more value over time due to the fact that you're seeing a real emotion within a person, which I think is going to trigger something kind of within us. And I think that with all of that, with any of these like imperfections that you're adding into photographs, that I think that's really in the end goal, at least for me, and I think for most people, your goal is to try to add in more of that like emotional element to the image. And so I think that these imperfect photos are only becoming more valuable if they're accomplishing that goal of adding the emotion into the images.
Yeah, I wouldn't describe that as imperfect. I think you're, like he said it perfectly, leaning into the emotion of the edit. And I think there's like an emotional, timeless aspect, I think, that goes with the way that you described of editing that photo, which for someone that you're remembering, I think, again, brings up those emotions and those feelings. So, I mean, I wouldn't call that imperfect. I think you nailed it. So I wouldn't call those imperfect.
Hey, I would just add to that. I think as wedding photographers, this is kind of like quite dangerous territory, because you've got a huge responsibility photographing those moments and that day. And actually, Neil brought this up really well when he was talking about the pro mist filters. I think if you're going to introduce any of these techniques into your photography, you've got to be quite a master of it, quite confident, because something like the pro mist, you're burning softness, you're embedding it into those raw files, and you can never reverse that. So, if you're getting the last shot of somebody's granddad and it's been raining really heavy and you've got this super soft image and it doesn't, it's too much, you can't reverse that. So yeah, I don't mean to sound like a total stiff, but I just think, for us, that's why we've moved away from pro mist filters towards trying to add it in post-process, so we have a bit more control over it. But someone like Neil has been doing this a long time, and he is a master of probably using those filters. So it's just like a word of caution, I guess.
I'll just say that someone cost me £50 because I bought that John Dolan book.
I blame Nathan for that.
Hey, it's really good though. So
I do like photography books. That I was like, yeah, like say, like I might never do it, but I just love books like that. So yeah, I've just purchased it there.
Like of Nathan, but like Nathan also has a podcast, and a person that you just bought a book of is potentially going to be a guest on said podcast coming soon. So, yes, Nathan, do you want to give your podcast a shameless plug?
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of hard to find. I didn't do enough research on the name before I did it, so there's too many with a similar name, but it's called Who Cares? A podcast for creative entrepreneurs. And yeah, I have John scheduled to be interviewed at the end of this month. I believe it's like the 21st or 22nd. So his episode will probably be coming out at the beginning of March.
Which, let's face it, is a pretty big get. That's amazing. Like, congrats.
Yeah, I was a little bit excited. I tried to keep my cool with it, but like, he's one of my photography heroes, and I probably spent the rest of that day just being excited that he said yes.
I mean, let's face it, it was more than a day. But yeah.
Maybe I still am, honestly.
Make sure he hears this before he comes on the podcast so he knows how happy you are, for sure. But yeah, so like if you want to like listen to him talk about what went into the photography, if you're a John Dolan fan, like give Nathan a look and get the podcast followed. But that said, like I want to say a big thank you to everybody for listening. If you want more of this, there are 2 more Roundtable episodes already in your podcast app. And there is an interview with Dennis Roy Coronel that went live Monday of this week. So feel free to check that out too. I want to say an enormous thank you to everybody that participated in the conversation. And thanks again for listening.